Welcome, everyone. We'll get started shortly. We're just letting people join the Zoom room. Looking forward to our event for Kaleidoscope this evening. All right, let's get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to P&P Live. My name is Margaret Orto, and I'm the events coordinator in the Children and Teens Department of Politics and Prose. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and tuning into this format where we continue to bring authors and new books to you. I have the pleasure of introducing our event this evening. I'm delighted to welcome our guests, Brian Selznick and David Levithan, to celebrate the publication of Kaleidoscope. If you purchased a copy of Kaleidoscope for the event, your books are available for pickup in store or are being shipped to you. You can also click the link we will drop in the chat to get additional copies of the book. For those who purchased the $5 event-only admission ticket, if you decide you'd like to buy a copy of Kaleidoscope, look for an email from P&P after the event that offers a coupon to put your ticket entrance fee toward the purchase of a book. And just so everyone knows, we have signed book plates for these books while supplies last. Tonight, if you have a question for our panelists, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and add one there. At the end of the chat, Brian will have time to answer some of your questions. You can also upvote the questions you like and want answered. Now on to introductions for the event you're all waiting for. Brian Selznick is an author and artist, often blending words and pictures in his storytelling. He is the Caldecott Medal-winning creator of the bestsellers The Invention of Hugo Cabret, adapted into Martin Scorsese's Oscar-winning movie Hugo, and Wonderstruck, adapted into the movie by celebrated filmmaker Todd Haynes, with a screenplay by Selznick. His books, The Marvels and Baby Monkey, Private Eye, are also New York Times bestsellers. Tonight, David Levithan will be in conversation with Brian. David Levithan is the author of many acclaimed YA novels, including Every Day, Boy Meets Boy, and Two Boys Kissing. His most recent novel is The Mysterious Disappearance of Aiden S., as told to his brother. By day, he is a publisher and editorial director at Scholastic. So anyway, it's now time to turn the event over to David and to Brian and begin the conversation. Take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. It is so awesome to be at Politics and Prose. Again, it would be much more fun to be in Politics and Prose, the building and the store, but it's great to be able to be virtually at Politics and Prose, one of our favorite bookstores in the country. So yeah, so this is fun. So basically, this is a matchup. I was the editor for this book. Brian is the author illustrator of this book. So basically, we have the person in the world who has read it the most times and the person who has read it the second most times here in conversation to talk about Kaleidoscope. And it's really fun to have this opportunity. It's especially fun, I must say, just as a preface, because we do know the book came out yesterday. So we know a lot of people in the audience might not have had a chance to read it yet. You are hopefully waiting for your copies that you're going to be getting in the mail from Politics and Prose. And if you aren't waiting for one, you should really order one so you can get one in the mail from Politics and Prose. So we're going to be very careful because one of the things about this book is that you really need to discover it on your own terms. And as will, I'm sure, come up in our discussion, even Brian and I, the person who has read it the most and the person who's read it the second most, don't necessarily experience the book in the same way or necessarily know the same things about the book, which is one of the beauties of the book. So it's going to be an interesting conversation with us. If it seems like we're trying to elude definition, that is absolutely deliberate on our part. But one thing we will not elude is sort of the story of how this book came to be. And Brian has put together a presentation to really give you sort of an overview with visuals about how this book came to be. So I'm about to hand it over to Brian and be sort of a lazy host for a few minutes. Then he and I are going to talk a bit about the process, and I have a few questions I've never asked him, which I'm really excited to ask him. And then obviously we really want to hear from you and any questions that you have, which, as Margaret said, you can put in that Q&A tab in the Zoom. we will very, very much be relying upon that for the audience questions. So hopefully you'll have lots of questions. All right, now, Brian, my friend, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, David. I'm so happy to be here at Politics and Prose virtually with you. Thank you for being a part of this, and thank you and everybody at Scholastic for publishing Kaleidoscope so beautifully, and thanks for hosting us, Politics and Prose. And I want to say David has another new book out actually called Take Me With You When You Go, along with Jennifer Niven. And so I want to encourage everyone to also get a copy of this. I have my copy here and I'm very eager to read it. And so I want to just talk a little bit about sort of what led up to the creation of Kaleidoscope, and then a little bit, you'll see it, I'll show you a little bit from inside the book. And then this is just a few minutes. I'm going to share my screen to show some images, and then we'll take the conversation from there. So I am going to share my screen now, and here we go. I always like to start with a nice pair of red curtains. And so the story of Kaleidoscope really begins with the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown. I was stuck in New York at the beginning of the lockdown, and my husband was stuck in San Diego. So we didn't know how long it was going to be until we'd be able to see each other again. And so this was the view from the roof of my building at 7 p.m. when we would go up to applaud for the essential workers. And this was really the only time I would see anybody, because we would wave to the neighbors on the roof. And I'm sure everybody had many people had various versions of this experience. And I spent a good amount of time feeling unable to move. I just sort of laid out on my couch, watched some Tiger King along with everyone else, got really into Werner Herzog films because he made films about people in extreme situations, which seemed commensurate with what we were all experiencing. But eventually a kid across the street put this sign up in the window that said, "Let's make art." And it had been a few weeks since I had made anything. I couldn't work. I couldn't make my books. I couldn't do anything. But seeing this injunction from this kid across the street got me moving. And so the first thing I did was I remembered a quote that a friend of mine had shared with me from the poet W.S. Merwin: "On the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree." And she had just shared this quote with me via email. And it was one of the first things that really began to help me feel a little bit better. It was just that idea of being hopeful in the face of the end of everything seemed important. And so I had this big postcard collection. I don't know, I started like 20 years ago, I started it, just sitting in a drawer. And so I took one of the postcards and I cut the quote into the postcard with an X-Acto knife. And the next day I wasn't feeling quite as optimistic, so I made this one. And then a friend told me he felt like he was in a black hole, so I made this one. And then I just started feeling like I needed to keep making things with these postcards. So I just began to cut into the postcards, and it became like a meditation. It became like a conversation with me and the subject in the postcards, or me and the artist. And so that was really helpful. And I had about 48 postcards, and then I ran out of postcards. And so a friend of mine who lived in my neighborhood, who was also stuck here, his husband was elsewhere, started dropping things off for me on my stoop. And so he dropped off this amaryllis, and I didn't know anything about flowers. I didn't know what an amaryllis was. So the shock of watching this red flower grow and the joy of the color became what felt very much like a lifeline. So I started drawing the amaryllis. And then the amaryllis started to die. And in dying, it became, in a way, even more beautiful. And so I started drawing the dying amaryllis. But then I didn't feel like drawing the amaryllis anymore, but I really fell in love with the shapes, the red and the colors, the way it glowed. So I did something I don't do very often, which is I made a big abstract painting. And big for me, it's not big for most people probably. It's 16 by 16. And it's just the feeling that I had when I thought about the flower. And then my friend also dropped off a beautiful yellow flower, a daffodil for me. So I didn't want to exactly paint the daffodil, but I made this yellow painting. And then I figured if I have a red painting and a yellow painting, I should probably have a blue painting. And then I thought I should have a green painting, but the green painting and I did not get along well. We had a really big week-long fight, and well, we both lost, I guess. And so I painted out the green painting, and a voice came to me and it said, just use everything. And so I made this. And when I finished this, I had a sense of completion. It's sort of hard to describe. I didn't know what I was doing when I was making these or the postcards. It was or even the flowers. It was a kind of a sense of instinct that I was following. But when I finished this picture, something told me I was done and I needed to go back to work. And by work, I meant thinking about my books again, because I do a lot of different things, but I mostly think of myself as a bookseller. And so I've been, for the last 5 years, or the 5 years at the beginning of the pandemic, the previous 5 years, I'd been working on and off on a book that was very Gothic, very inspired by the book Rebecca. This is all 4 of the paintings together. And like I said, this is sort of like, I don't know, now I look at them and it's sort of like I'm looking at teachers, like they were teaching me something. Although, as I said, at the moment, I didn't know what it was. And so when I turned to that book that I had been working on for about 5 years, that was inspired by Daphne du Maurier and Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, it was going to be very Gothic, sort of a little bit like, maybe a little bit like Hugo or Wonderstruck or the Marvels, big, long, mysterious story told in words and pictures. The plot of this book, as I was working on it over the last 5 years, just never came together. And in the meantime, I made other books. I made a ballet. I wrote the story for a ballet that Christopher Wheeldon did at the Joffrey. I wrote films. I did a lot of other things, but I kept going back to this book. And Rebecca, as many of you know, it has, a very famous first line, "Last night I dreamt I went to Manderley again." And this is Manderley in the movie. And in real life, I had gone for many summers to this beautiful stately home in Cornwall, England called Port Eliot. And it turns out Port Eliot is not too far from the house that inspired Daphne du Maurier to write Rebecca. And so this area is where Rebecca takes place. And Kathy St. Germans and her husband, Peregrine St. Germans, lived in this house. The house had been in Perry's family for about 500 or 600 years. Perry passed away a few years ago, and Kathy has since moved to another home in Cornwall. But while they lived there together, they had a big book and music festival that was really extraordinary. And I would go, we would go every summer. And so I spent a lot of time in this house and moving through the rooms of this house, learning about the history of the house, walking through the grounds, going through these doorways, was really, really inspiring. And so in the book that was going to be inspired by Rebecca and Port Eliot, I imagined a little girl coming to Port Eliot, or a house like Port Eliot, and perhaps meeting a father who she never knew. But as I said, the plot never really worked. This is me at Port Eliot in Perry's office at his desk working on the book. And then one day, about 3 years into working on the story, a character suddenly appeared in the story. And here he's described as a week or two after school started, curled up on the window seat. I thought I saw something strange down below. The narrator is a first person narrator, like in Rebecca. You never find out their name. At this point, the narrator was a girl in the Rebecca version of the story. And she's at school before she goes to this mysterious house. And she says, "A small white shape was floating through the gardens like a ghost. I thought perhaps I'd briefly fallen asleep or my eyes were playing tricks on me. And within moments it was gone. I closed the shutters and got into my giant bed. Over the next few weeks, there were several more times I thought I saw the strange white figure in the gardens, but just as quickly it would disappear. Soon the ghost had worked its way into my dreams." And that figure turns out to be a little boy who lives across the garden, who's very sickly, shaved head, white nightgown, who I named James. And the problem with James was that he never actually fit into the story. But once he appeared, I couldn't get rid of him. I tried to make the story about him at one point. I made it from James's point of view. I made James appear at the house. James just wouldn't go away, and he ruined the plot. And so I didn't know what to do with James. And so when I was thinking about my work again and thinking about how in my previous books, like The Invention of Hugo Cabret, Wonderstruck, The Marvels, and then a book I did for grownups called Live Oak with Moss, I was using words and pictures to tell a bigger, more complicated mystery, a big story. And I realized that that was not the book I was able to make as I was sitting alone in my house in the pandemic with the world having shut down. And after having worked on Rebecca for so long, I had hundreds and hundreds of pages of writing. And that voice that came to me right before I did that rainbow colored painting that said, just use everything, meant to me, use what you love. Like just use what you love. Don't limit yourself. And so I looked at these hundreds of pages from Rebecca that weren't working. And that same voice came back to me and it said, just take from here what you love and get rid of everything else. So I pulled a sentence that I loved, a paragraph, a place like this garden door that you'll recognize from the real garden at Port Elliot. And those I kept. I kept the unnamed first person narrator, and James also wouldn't go away. And so what I began to do was take each of those snippets, those little pieces of writing, and turn them into individual short stories. And in each of the short stories, there was a first person unnamed narrator who I also at a certain point realized that we were never going to find out their gender either. So they're a genderless, unnamed, well, they may have a gender, but we don't know what the gender is. And we don't know their name. And in each story, there's someone named James who they are friends with or who they love. And in most of the stories, as I was writing, I realized what was happening was James was either disappearing or dying in story after story after story. And these were self-contained stories. They took place in different time periods. Sometimes one or both of them wasn't human. One of them might be a doll or a giant or an angel. And at a certain point, I realized I wanted to have 24 stories. That seemed like a good number. And originally it wasn't going to be illustrated, but I can talk a little bit more with David about the impetus for the drawings. But I do have a few examples for anybody who hasn't actually seen the book yet, that what we see in the book are a drawing and then a kaleidoscoped version of that drawing. So the drawing seen through a kaleidoscope. And so this is just a few examples of some of the drawings are not used in this book the way they were in Hugo or Wonderstruck or the Marvels. The stories, as I said, because they were meant to stand on their own, to exist only as writing, were originally conceived to have no images. And so I'm going to unshare my screen now, and I'm going to bring us back to David and ask David where he thinks we should begin from here.
I think we should begin with me unmuting myself. And then, no, I would love to, again, yeah, let's continue the talk about the process, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the creation and question my burning questions. Then we'll get to everybody else's burning questions. It occurs to me, and maybe because I thought the answer was obvious, and now I'm wavering. So bear with me, because I think there's a long setup for this question. But one of my favorite questions to ask other authors is, do you see the story as you're writing it? And for me, the answer is no, not at all. For me, it is all about the words, the sound, and the placement of the words, and them on the page, and I'm hearing it. But I don't know what my characters look like. I don't particularly see the scene as it is unfolding. And as I've asked this question, which came because my co-authors almost entirely do see when they're writing, it ends up that it's about 75-25, that maybe a quarter people are like me and really focused on the word or the sound, but most are focused on the visual. So my somewhat complicated question is, first, just in general, whether you do visualize, and as you visualize, do you visualize in terms of your writing or your art style, or just in terms of the way the scene is playing out, as if it was a movie playing out? And then I'm going to throw the curveball question part of it, just out of curiosity, because this book was conceived as you're writing it to not have illustrations. And did you actually approach the writing different, knowing that you had no intention of actually drawing any of it?
Mm. So when I am working on a story, generally, I begin, or I've come to realize over the years that I work in a relatively backwards fashion. The first things that come to me are things in places that interest me. It very often is a location, like Port Elliot, like there will be a house or a place, a city, something that I have learned that intrigues me, that I want to set a story around. And so it's almost like I'm building a machine backwards, and I don't know what the finished machine is, but I have some of the parts. And then I begin to create characters that fit into that location and can set a plot in motion that will tie all of those things together. And then the very last thing that comes to me is the emotional reason that drives the character to make the plot that causes everything to happen. And the last thing, the emotional element, is the most important one. But because it's the one that comes to me last, I often feel like I have a rudderless machine, or I have a skeleton of a machine, and it feels like a skeleton. Like I can, and so I think because I'm a visual person in general, and because I was trained as an artist, I see everything, right? Like I can see my characters really clearly. I can see the places. I can often see what they're wearing, but I'm really bad at drawing from my head. So in a weird way, even though I see everything extremely clearly, I need a huge amount of visual research to translate what I see in my head onto the page. And so if I'm drawing something, even though I know what they look like in my head, I need a human model who I will ask to pose for me. I often get the actual clothes and put a version of the clothing on them. If I can't do that research or find the right clothes, I can put other clothes on the model and look at how the creases work, and then just change the style, so that it's in the right time period. And because I see everybody so clearly, and because my books like Hugo, Wonderstruck, and The Marvels have so many drawings, I generally don't need to describe anybody in writing because you see them. And there's no need to do both. If you're going to see everybody, you don't need to describe them. And when I was making Hugo, I also realized I didn't need to describe or talk about a lot of emotion, because a lot of the emotion would appear in the drawings. So there are a lot of things that I took out of writing that I had done in Hugo because it was going to be in pictures. And then when it comes time to write, or actually when it comes time to do anything, before I even draw one picture, I write everything. So even if I'm going to do a series of drawings, or I know that I want to do a series of drawings, I will write what the drawings are. Like we see the moon, and then we see the moon over Paris, and then we see a train station in Paris, and then we move closer. So I will write all of what I want, what I'm seeing it in my head, like a movie. I don't see things in my style, right? My crosshatch style. Right. I see things very realistically, which is why there's often a sense of disappointment when I finish a picture, because as nice as it may be as a drawing, it never looks like what I see in my head. But I do also recognize when a drawing comes out good. Like I do have pleasure in the finished drawing, but there's always a gap between the finished art and what I had been seeing in my head. And so as I was writing the stories that became Kaleidoscope, I was moving on again, like on a kind of instinct. And there was a kind of, I'm going to use the word ease, but I don't want that to make it sound like it was easy, even though that's the actual definition of the word. You know, right, like I was describing Rebecca, the earlier version, I'd been struggling with it for 5 years. So much of my writing process I've described as a struggle in the past, finding the right words. Because so I need to draw someone running through a hallway, I can see that in my head and I can draw it. But the words are harder for me. He was running down the hallway. He ran down the hallway. He ran quickly down the hallway. He ran quickly down the stone hallway. Like, you know, like which one do you choose? And so writing has always been a little bit more difficult for me. But again, with Kaleidoscope, I feel like I had bypassed a certain part of my brain or my personality that was questioning things. And it just was like my subconscious was going. And so I was writing so then in a way, in the words, it was all kind of happening together. I was listening to the rhythm of the language itself, because if you read my words out loud, I feel like the rhythm that I think in comes through in the writing. I often realize that there is a certain beat that happens when I'm writing. Sometimes I have to undercut it because the sentences can actually repeat themselves with that beat without me realizing it. But sometimes that rhythm can help move the action along, the emotion along, the story along. And so what was coming to me was so odd, and it was very dreamlike, right? They were these very dreamlike images. And I realized as I was writing that it was very important for what I was seeing to come through in the language as much as possible, but then to connect with the reader directly. And so in a weird way, I feel like this book, even when it had no pictures, was fully illustrated. It was just that the reader was going to be doing the illustrations. And so I don't know, like I don't actually think there's many descriptions in the book, or any descriptions in the book, of what anybody looks like. I mean, sometimes someone has wings, and sometimes someone is a doll, and sometimes somebody is a giant, and sometimes somebody is a knight, so I might describe the armor that they're wearing. But I don't think there's a single moment in any of the stories where it describes what either of the characters, the narrator or James, look like physically. It never says what ages they are, although you can guess from the context of some of the stories that they must be children or they must be adults. And that was all. I'm describing this now in a way that almost seems to make sense to me, but at the time, I can't express how much it felt like it didn't make sense. It was just these things that were coming to me. But I think in there might be an answer to your question about understanding why I wanted the things that I saw to appear with freedom in the reader's head, because that's what reading does. Like, you know, when we're reading a book that has no pictures, even if you're not an artist yourself, you very clearly see everybody. You might not realize why you're seeing things the way, it might not even be what's described. It might even be different than what's literally described, but you see it clearly. And that's why people are often frustrated with movies, because one human actor generally has to play a character that thousands or millions of people have imagined separately. And so there is no one human actor who's going to look like that character, but sometimes an actor can embody an element of that character that we can all fall in love with. But that's part of why it's so challenging, I think, to cast someone in a movie. It's for this very reason.
Yeah, and for the prose, I mean, one of the things that struck me, again, as somebody who's read all of your work over the years, and to be clear, and has not edited it, has always been just a very happy reader and friend until this book, where I got to be sort of the special guest star editor. I mean, I'm always amazed, and I've worked with many authors who this has been true, that a lot of the times, as with when you're writing poetry, the smaller the scale, the more precise the writing is. That when you don't have to think about carrying the larger narrative, and when you're not sort of overwhelmed by setting up things for 100 pages later, or stressing out about sort of juggling all these different subplots, you really can focus almost on a microscopic level on the writing. And I felt that when I first read it, I felt, wow, this small scale has really elevated Brian's writing, because like every word is in the right place, or just clearly the care has been spent there. And then part of the editorial process for us, really, it was all almost on the word level. I mean, it was arguing about, does this word go here? Does this word go here? Which again, I think the smaller scale and the way that it is 24 parts into a whole rather than one seamless whole, it does allow you to focus. One thing you mentioned last night when we were talking, not at our event, but I don't really know the pinpoint answer to, so I will ask, is the derivation of kaleidoscope. That by the time the book came to me, you were calling it Kaleidoscope, even though, as you said, there were no illustrations, and we'll talk about that. So before we talk about the art part, I am curious about sort of why you did choose to call it Kaleidoscope.
Mm-hmm. As I was moving towards the 24th story, because by the time I got to the 10th or the 11th story, I had a sense that I could write 2,000 of these. Like, they were just coming to me so quickly and naturally, and I was so excited about what I was doing that I felt like there was a chance I would just keep going. But I had a sense I needed and would benefit from a structure. And so The Invention of Hugo Cabret has 24 chapters because there's 24 hours in a day, and timekeeping and clockmaking is very important to that story. And time is one of the themes that became very important in many of the stories as I was writing them. And so I thought 24 makes sense for this book as well. So at a certain point, I then had a goal. I was like, okay, now I'm going to work towards 24 stories. And so I mentioned that I pulled the things I most loved from the book that had been Rebecca, but that only accounts for maybe 8 of the stories, 9 of the stories. And so what I then began doing was writing about things that I love elsewhere in the world, the stories that I had heard, things that intrigued me, anecdotes I had come across, facts that I love. Cecil B. DeMille made a silent movie of the 10 Commandments and built an entire Egyptian city in California in a desert. And at the end of filming, he buried the city, destroyed it and buried it. And apparently one of the sphinxes survived. So I was like, I've always been obsessed with that sphinx. And so things like that would come to me, and suddenly I would think, what is a story about that sphinx? And it's like, oh, it's the narrator meets a kid who has heard that this sphinx exists, and they go find it. They live in California. They know the desert where the sphinx is supposed to be buried, and they go try to find it. And then I would see what happens in my mind. And then at a certain point, what was happening would stop. And that was how I knew the story was over. And it was often not at a point of resolution. It was often at a point of a very big question. And so as I was working, I also began to realize that given the state of the world, given the kinds of things that were happening to everybody in the world, the way time was breaking down for everybody, the extremity of the situation, the fact that it felt like making a story that had a plot with a resolution and answers felt extremely dishonest. What felt honest to me in terms of having a conversation with kids and sharing, and really with anybody, was we need to think about the importance of questions. We need to think about the importance of asking the right questions and grappling with the unknown, because that's what we're in right now. And so elements that I was writing about, butterflies and fires and keys and apples and the Garden of Eden story I've always really loved. So I realized that these elements kept reappearing in several of the stories. So there is an entire story called Chrysalis, where James is obsessed with butterflies and simply explains to the narrator what happens inside a chrysalis. Because what happens inside a chrysalis, I had learned years ago, is absolutely mysterious and magical and strange and real, right? And we're all kind of in a chrysalis right now, right? The idea of metamorphosis is very present in the world in many ways. And so I began to realize that all these things kept shifting and reappearing from story to story, like the characters themselves. And I don't remember when it first hit me, but I realized that the stories themselves were like looking through a kaleidoscope, seeing the different pieces of colored glass, and they shift and they create different patterns. And the pieces of glass don't change, but the pattern, the way that we see it, changes. And so I realized that kaleidoscope would be a good way, a good metaphor to, in a way, tie all of these stories together. And one of the really beautiful first editorial notes that you had for me, which I really loved, was that little opening, that little just having a little moment where the narrator actually looks through a kaleidoscope. And then I saw the kaleidoscope, because there's a kaleidoscope which has the color bits, but then there's something called a teleoscope, which I'm sure you've all seen also, which has like a glass ball at the end, and you look and you see the world through it. So when I say kaleidoscope, what I really mean is a kind of a combination of a kaleidoscope and a teleoscope, where you're looking at the world and the world itself fragments. And, and then I saw the narrator turning and looking at James, and James fragmenting. And that felt like the right metaphor for a book that became 24 chapters, in which each of the chapters were an independent short story about two independent people, but also a chapter in an entire story, possibly about the same two people.
I think Teleoscope will obviously be the sequel. I'm glad that we've already. I'm glad. I mean, all I need to do. Scholastic invested well in paying that kid to hold that "Let's Make Art" sign across from your apartment. Like, it only took like $100. We just FedExed it to him. Was like, "You're across from Brian, right? Just please put that up, and maybe he'll make art."
It really worked.
So speaking of making art, so again, the irony again. I'm not usually an editor of illustration and illustrated works, although I do some graphic novels and graphic memoirs. But so when you brought this to me, you said, I don't think that there's going to be illustration. I don't really know how illustration would come into it. And me, the rank amateur, was like, hey, Brian, the title of the book is Kaleidoscope. So maybe the illustrations could be kaleidoscopes. And basically from that really sage, just eloquent observation, we actually did sort of have the conversation of how the art came to be. And I did sneak a peek at the Q&A, and I do think both questions sort of asked in part sort of what the process was like, and sort of, so could you talk about, again, both sort of the role the art plays in the book is very different, as you noted, from in your previous books, but also I think people are fascinated by the process by which you took your illustrations and turned them into kaleidoscopes.
Yeah, so I was intrigued by what you said about the kaleidoscopes. And so what I did was I came up with one strong image for each of the 24 stories. One, and by strong image, I mean something that felt to me in a bold way would get across an idea of the story. Because one of the challenges is with a story that has a book that has an unnamed narrator whose gender is not identified, you can't draw the narrator because that would identify them. And I knew I couldn't draw James. And so I've never done a book where I don't draw people and the characters. And so I had to find something in the stories that would be an intriguing, important moment from the story. And if it is going to be seen first, before the story, it can't give anything away. But when you get to that thing in the story, hopefully it would help spark a memory of having just seen that image. It's like a close-up in a film, or the way Hitchcock uses the camera when he wants you to know that something's important. He will often pan through a very long series of places until he comes to something very important, and then to remember that. And so having a single image open up a chapter is a very classic way to illustrate books. There's, that's throughout history that has been used, and when it's done well, it's often with this idea to highlight a particular scene. But I wanted to see if I could highlight a particular emotion or a particular element in the story, sometimes that are just mentioned in passing. There's a story called The Spirit Machine, and there's a very brief mention of the angel grappling with Jacob from the Bible. But for some reason, that was what I felt I needed to draw. And so then it was a matter of looking through those images my first idea was to look through an actual kaleidoscope or an actual teleoscope at the images and try to capture that somehow with a camera. But the idea that we would have the kaleidoscopic image that is sort of an abstracted design that you can't really tell what it is. But I wanted to make sure that there were elements of the finished drawing in the kaleidoscope. And then you turn the page and you kind of get the answer, right? Like it's kind of a quick revelation. Like, oh, that was a bird, or oh, that was a gate. And what it does also, and one of the reasons I realized that having these pictures was the correct thing for this book that I originally didn't want to have illustrated, was because the text is so intense. And it is more like, in a lot of ways, it's more like poetry, in terms of the density of the images. Having these two, it's 3 pages of pictures before, it's 2 pictures, but one's on a double page spread. Before every story and after every story gives you and your imagination a moment to rest. So because that's what's always interested in me when I'm illustrating a book, is what happens in your mind when you're looking at words versus when you're looking at the pictures, and how even if, like in Hugo, they're a continuation of the same story, it still switches and uses a different part of your brain. And so the pictures in the kaleidoscope allow you to have a moment, even though there's a lot happening in the kaleidoscope and there's patterns and images, the story has stopped. So even though you're looking at something complex, you still can rest, you can take a breath, you can turn the page, see what the image was, and then move into the next story. And so should I say how I actually did
Yeah, I think you can.
images?
Yeah.
So Like I said, I first tried to find an actual kaleidoscope to look through, but then I don't know if this will work. I wonder if I can do this.
Yeah, no.
But I found an app called Kaleidocam, Kaleidacam. I highly recommend it. And you can look through it. Let's see this. Let's see. Let's see.
Yeah, we can see it.
You get the idea. And
Yeah.
so whatever it's looking through, you can see, and you can change the patterns, you can change, and then when you like it, you can just press the button and it saves it. And so all of the kaleidoscopes were, I mean, I took thousands of these pictures because I wanted to capture, as I said, an actual element that might spark your imagination. But it was really fun to use. And then we contacted the folks who made Kaleidocam, and they said, you know, everything that you make with their app belongs to you. And so I highly recommend, if anybody who's a teacher is watching,
Yeah.
it'd be really fun to share with students. It's very, very fun to use. And so I then sent the high resolution images off to Scholastic, and we did some correction and did some changes to adjust the dark and the light. And then I think they came out pretty nicely.
Indeed. All right, I have another question, but again, I'm going to encourage everybody to go to the Q&A. We have about 15 minutes left, so I will be asking those questions as well. We covered a lot already. But I'm curious again about sort of the freedom of the fragmentation. And you were talking before we came on tonight about your grandparents' house makes an appearance in the book. And what I love about the freedom of the fragmentation is I would make a very strong argument that of all of the books that you've written, there is more of you that you were able to put into this book than any other book, because you're not writing historical Paris, you're not writing historical Hoboken, New Jersey, you're not writing historical London or about a historical figure in the picture books or Walt Whitman. It was so freeform that it almost, again, from you talking about it, I won't want to say it's free associative, but it was that you could conceivably pull from whatever you wanted, from life, from art, from conversations, from relationships. And that is what's so alive about the book, is that it does reach for all of those places. So I'd love for you to talk about specifically sort of pulling from the personal and how, again, I don't want you to explain anything in the book, but about, again, having the opportunity to do that, which you don't ordinarily get to do with your books.
Yeah, there's always elements of me, of course, in everything I do. Right. And so much of, like, I remember when I was writing Hugo and I was describing the sense of what it's like when he's fixing things. Because Hugo's the only character I've ever written who has a special talent. All of the other kids I've made, the kids in Wonderstruck and the Marvels, they're average kids who get put into extraordinary circumstances and then have to deal with them. But Hugo had a special talent, and he was able to fix machines. And I remember when I was a kid, I wasn't good with machines, but I remember the knowledge, the understanding that I could draw. Right, that the other students in class would gather around me sometimes, like even in kindergarten, I remember them like gathering around me, and so I knew that I had something in my hands that I could do. But I also remember like trying to put together a model, like a plastic model, and my fingers not being good enough yet to put the pieces together. So that sense of what happens in your hands was very much a part of Hugo. But you're right, I hadn't really thought about it. The idea that so much of the specific stories, so many of the specific places, so much of what I describe is directly from my life. The second to last story in Kaleidoscope takes place in my elementary school from East Brunswick, New Jersey. Warnsdorfer. It's not called Warnsdorfer. You don't see the name of the school, but there is a drawing of Warnsdorfer Elementary School that illustrates that title. And if you go to Warnsdorfer Elementary School, there it is. And so that tree I added because it's part of the story, but that is the facade of Warnsdorfer. And so if anybody, listening goes to Warnsdorfer Elementary or is by, like, that's what it looks like. There's a story where James takes the narrator to their grandparents' house, which David was just mentioning. And every single detail in that story, everything that the narrator sees, the furniture that's under plastic, the tables that have glass tops with old photographs underneath the glass, the pictures on the wall, the porcelain bulldog on the fireplace, the painting of the fortune teller above the fireplace, all of those things, even the pictures like that were made out of cut up stamps, were things that were actually in my grandmother's house. And then the one thing that wasn't there was what the story's about. It's called The Glass Shipwreck, and there's a three-dimensional sort of diorama in a frame made out of it looks like sparkling jewels. Turns out it is sparkling jewels, but they don't know it. It's a little tiny scene of a shipwreck. And that's the one thing that I made up. But then my husband, David, would also tell me stories from his childhood. And so some of those stories also directly went into the book as well. There was a story that he told me about a memory he had of one of his classmates who died very unexpectedly when he was in elementary school. And so there were certain details in that, in the telling of that, that really stuck with me. And so and so some of those elements weave in certain places. And again, the whole thing is a psychological portrait of me at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Because I mentioned that David and I were stuck on opposite sides of the country, and I was able to finally get to him after 3 months. So we had a nice reunion, I think at the beginning of June of 2020. And I had maybe written 5 or 6 of the stories, maybe a few more by the time I got back to David. And then I finished the book while I was in San Diego, and he was the first person I would read the stories to. And so he would often recognize a lot of the specific personal details. But it was a way to share these, I don't know, I'm thinking about it now, like now that you've mentioned it, I guess there was a sense of safety in being able to talk about these things in this format, because it was so fantastical and so fragmented, yet also felt completely connected and completely a part of what I needed to express, right? Because the idea that there also needs to be hope was very important for myself, right? And so the need for hope comes through again and again and again in these stories. And I knew that there was nothing I was experiencing that was unique. Like I was experiencing what everybody was experiencing in some fashion. And so the idea that readers will have connections with different elements, and again, that's why the story will be different for each of the readers, because you'll have, I'm telling you now about all of the things that are really explicitly mine, but ultimately, I think it explicitly becomes yours.
Well, and I think it also, again, you said at the beginning, it's very dreamlike, and I feel that is how dreams work. That's sometimes you're on the moon, and then suddenly you find yourself in your grandparents' house that you haven't been in for 30 years, and then you're in front of your elementary school. All right, we are so going to have to go speed round with the audience questions, because we have about 6 or 7 minutes, and we already have about 4 questions. So I'm gonna we're gonna do these quick. We got like a minute or 2 per question. So I'm gonna start. Wendy Lucart was the first one with a question.
Hi, Wendy.
And she said, I've had the pleasure of reading Kaleidoscope several times. As I think about the notion that readers bring their own knowledge and experience to a book, I'm curious to know if you've had any comments or questions from kids who have read the book.
So the one group of people who I have not talked to yet about the experience is kids. And I did get an early copy of the book to a friend of mine who's a teacher. They are finishing up the book right now, and I'm scheduled to Zoom with the class next week on the day that they finish the book. And he shared with me some videos that the kids, that he made of the kids while they were talking about the first couple of stories. And these were 4th and 5th graders, which is a very good age for this. I do also imagine it for slightly older kids.
Yeah.
But that's a perfectly fine age. And it was very interesting because they were very aware of the connections between the stories. There was a giant here, a giant's mentioned here, and apples here. So I could see them thinking that, like most books, there's going to be a way that I tell you how everything comes together. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is talk to them. And I know some of them are going to be frustrated and there's going to be a lot of questions, but I'm really excited to talk to them about what their individual experiences are, and also validating for them the idea that what they think is right. That is actually part of what this book is hopefully going to do. And even if they don't get it right now, I hope that maybe one day in the future, if they're thinking about it, it will stick. So I do know, I have been told about a couple of kids who somebody shared the book with, and they were very intrigued by it. It was very positive. But this group of kids will be the first ones who I actually interact with. And I'm terrified and really excited to talk with them.
Yeah, I will say that the people at Scholastic their kids read it, and it was fascinating because, again, they read a different book than we did, although we were all reading different books from each other. All right, Linda Morris has a question, and this question could be an hour in itself, so you're going to have to go with first thought, best thought. As you think back on all the books you have written, do you have a favorite story, and do you have a favorite writing experience, which may be a different book from your favorite story?
Wow. So every book I've made because I love what it's about, because I want to know more about it. Right. So I've been very lucky in that I've been able to only make books that I love. And it usually takes me 3 years to make a book. Like Hugo, Wonderstruck, and the Marvels each took 3 years. I told you the version of Rebecca that didn't work, I was working on and off for 5 years. And then Kaleidoscope took maybe 6 months, like 5 months less in total. And so when I look back on what I've made, I remember the exciting discoveries I made with each of the books, the trips, getting to go to Paris for Hugo, getting to go to the Crystal Palace when I did the Dinosaurs of Waterhouse Hawkins, the people who I've met, the experts in each of the fields, the meeting David Milne at the Dennis Seaver's house when I was doing the Marvels, and hearing about him and Dennis, like those connections and the people who I've made, and then the readers who I met after the books came out, and the conversations who I've had, like those have all been really so important and so positive. And now Kaleidoscope feels like it's in that tradition, but because it's so raw and the world is so raw and the book is, I feel maybe because there is more of me in it directly, even though it's more fragmented, I feel more exposed in a certain way and a little bit more scared. But the stories and the connections I've been having with the people who have read Kaleidoscope so far have been really profound. And it really has been ultimately what I learn about when I talk about Kaleidoscope with people is the people who I'm talking to, because it brings up stories from them that I didn't know. Family members were telling me things about themselves that I didn't know, inspired by things in the book. So I hope that and greatly look forward to getting to actually have conversations about the book with you.
That, I think, is a lovely note for us to end on. We have hit the top of the hour, so apologies to Elisa and your cousin Eileen, who sent in questions we did not get to, but they also would have taken probably another half hour to answer. So it's good. Leave them wanting more, right? So we will return now to Margaret.
Yeah, no, thanks to both of you, David and Brian, for a fabulous conversation. I wish we had more time. We'd all like to listen to both of you all evening. But just a reminder for those who purchase the event only admission ticket, I think after you've heard this discussion, if you decide you'd like to buy a copy of Kaleidoscope, look for an email from P&P after the event that offers a coupon to put your ticket entrance fee toward the purchase of a book. And for those who already are expecting their book, they're ready for pickup and they're being shipped out now. So again, thanks to the audience for joining us this evening, and especially grateful to Brian and David for sharing about this wonderful new book tonight. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Night.